talk about church history. I'm doing a series on this. The idea is just to give an overview. And we started in the Old Testament with the need for two testaments. What is a testament? Why do we need two of them? We talked about the failure of the Jews to keep the first covenant, how God promised the second one, and so forth. Then we looked at the period of exile and the period in between the testaments and the developments there that kind of paved the way for Christianity. And then we looked at a brief kind of an overview of the book of Acts and what it was about. And we saw that actually, if you want to understand one of the main points of Acts, it is the story of the history of the origins of Christianity, the spread of Christianity. And in Acts, we see how, the kingdom of God came to the earth through the ministry of Christ and was first established in Israel, in Jerusalem especially. But then Jesus himself said that it would spread from Jerusalem to Judea, southern Israel, and from there to Samaria, farther to the north, and from there to the uttermost parts of the earth. And the book of Acts gives you those beginnings. It talks about how it did indeed, the gospel did indeed spread exactly as Jesus had predicted, and ended up in the latter part of the book of Acts spreading toward the west into the Roman Empire. You end up with Paul in Rome. So you see the Christian faith start as a completely Jewish phenomenon, and then it begins to spread to Hellenistic Jews who were of sort of were acculturated to the Hellenistic way of life. And then from there, it spread to actual Gentiles, non-Jews, and first in the house of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, but then through Paul and Barnabas further west into Europe. And we saw how this was rather traumatic at first for the Jewish believers. It was a huge deal for them to switch from a strictly Jewish worldview and mindset to the understanding that this gospel could be for all kinds of people everywhere, and that they didn't have to become Jews. And so in Acts 15, we have the first real crisis where there's a council called, and the leaders, the apostles and elders debate about it, and they make the crucial decision that Gentile believers do not have to become Jews. And that allows for the spread of the gospel to a much broader world. Now, we talked about those kind of things. I want to mention to you briefly a book which I recommend called The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. You've often heard me speak about him. He's a terrific writer. I really have learned so much from him. But I want to mention a few things from that book because Rodney Stark is a sociologist and he's done studies on things like how cults can spread in a society. What does it take for a radically new set of beliefs to be accepted by society? People don't tend to accept things, ideas that are foreign to them. And so what does it take for people to accept those ideas? And he looks into that, and he studied Mormonism and things like that. And he talks about things like the growth rate of Christianity. And some people have said, well, it couldn't have grown as fast as some say. That's too fast. But he shows that actually the growth rate is pretty believable. It's not that different from the growth rate of, say, Mormonism. And remember, with Christianity, you had several things going for you. You had the use of the Greek language, which was the kind of universal language of the area. The apostles spoke Greek and spread the message in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. You had the Roman roads and the Pax Romana maintaining peace and so forth. And you had a situation where people were not all that thrilled with the gods and the beliefs that they had. There was a lot of capriciousness about the Roman gods and so forth. And there were a lot of different belief systems in the ancient world. So when Christianity came in, it was actually, like today, some thought it was crazy and so forth. But actually, there were many attractive qualities about Christianity. It preached love, and it preached care for one another. And you could see that the Christian people cared for one another. It was a very harsh and cruel world in the ancient world, in Roman times. Very harsh and cruel. Many, many people were slaves. Remember that public entertainment was gladiatorial games. And people were allowed to, for example, if they had a baby they didn't like, they could put the baby out to die, throw it in the garbage heap. It was a coarse and harsh society. And Rodney Stark brings out some of these things. He talks about what life was like in the Mediterranean cities where Paul and Barnabas and others would have gone preaching the gospel. And as I read his book, I was quite, I don't know, it just impacted me because I've traveled a lot in the third world. And so I could relate to the images he was portraying of these cities. You know, the kind of rough Roman roads, cobblestone. You come into the town, there's some rich people in every town, and they have villas and stuff like that, which to us today would probably just be, you know, fairly nice. Still, they wouldn't be near as nice as what we have. But the majority of the people lived in tenements or in these terrible little shacks, little places, very small. You have to remember, sewage ran in the streets, trash was thrown in the streets. There was no glass, so you didn't have windows in your homes. You had a flap of cloth or leather hanging there to kind of keep the cold out or the rain. You cooked over a fire, you burned wood. And so it was smoky, bad for your lungs and so forth, a lot of respiratory disease. In fact, there was a lot of disease in general back then. And plagues were a frequent occurrence. They'd sweep through and everybody would die. And I thought, you know, that'd be like a small town where everybody knew everybody and all like that. But no, Stark says because of plagues and wars and all the economy being, you know, difficult and everything, you actually had a lot of turnover. People came and went. So a lot of times you didn't know your neighbors. So there was a lot of thievery. The neighbor might steal from you. You have to watch your stuff. And lifespans were short. People died in their 40s or 30s even. Many, many women died in childbirth. Many babies died within the first year of life, and so on. And so Christians had this compassion that God gave them. They had a message that was a message of love and a message of hope, because it said that, you know, this world wasn't all there was. There's another world, and you're going to live forever. And God loves you. He has a purpose for you. God is holy and clean. God is not perverse like the Greek gods or the Roman gods. God is loving. God is stable. He brings peace. We pray for healing for people who are sick. God heals people. This was a gospel that was accompanied with miracles many times. The apostles did miracles. People saw healings. And so it just brought a positive, beneficial influence to the community. And the apostles would come in and they'd preach in someone's home. So in these little homes that are all, you know, crammed in together without insulation and all that, other people could hear what was going on. So those people over there sing a lot. What are they singing about? It's the kind of thing where, you know, it's like a great kind of publicity, and people would be drawn to hear what's going on. These folks are singing. And according to Stark, a lot of times, probably the wealthier folks, believe it or not, some folks believe that only the poor would become Christian. In some cases, that was true. But a lot of times, wealthier folks would also come to Christ. We see this in the New Testament. Paul stayed in the home of various people of an upper class at times. He knew various leaders in Ephesus. You know, there were city leaders and so forth. So sometimes the folks that had more money and better homes and stuff would allow the apostles and the Christian leaders and all to come and hold church in their home. Remember, there were no church buildings. And so some of the nicer villas would have the Christian meetings there. And so folks would go there, they would have love feasts, they would eat together, they would have communion. You know, sometimes you read in the Bible, Paul spoke all the way to midnight and then went on till dawn speaking in a place, you know. And there was an upstairs room and they were up there and so forth. So these are some of the reasons why Christianity spread rapidly. Also during this time, there was a belief system called Neoplatonism, which actually started in Alexandria, Egypt, and a guy named Plotinus was a student of a guy named Socrates. And anyway, so, and some of the early Christian leaders actually were trained there as well. And this Neoplatonism was popular in Rome and various places. And it caused some of the upper class people to be kind of intellectually interested in those sorts of things. And Stark says that in some ways that may have made an opening for Christianity as well in the upper class, because you had people who were intellectuals and they wanted to discuss new things, you know. And so when the gospel came in, they wanted to hear about the gospel. And so this is just some of the things that I wanted to share with you about Christian growth and what it was like in these early days. Now, um, let's talk about persecution a little bit. What I'm doing as I'm going through this history is I'm going to talk about different subjects. Kind of there's a, you know, this subject we'll talk about for a while, and then we'll talk about this subject and so on. That's kind of how I'm doing it. So let's talk for a little bit about persecution. Some have heard about the persecution of the Romans and so forth, but let's talk about persecution in general. Who were the first persecutors of the Christian church? Well, from the book of Acts itself and from the Gospels, we see that they were the Jews. And someone might say, well, why was that? Why did the Jews persecute? Well, of course, if you read the Gospels, you'll see how that Jesus was an offense to kind of the established religious leaders of Judaism. He offended them. He offended them because, many reasons. One thing was, religion is an influence for good, but religion can always become a source of pride for people, unfortunately. Isn't that strange? But, some people are good at making money and they become proud about that. Some people are good at sports and they become proud about that, or beauty or whatever. Some people like religion and they are good at it. Maybe they are the kind of people who like to deny themselves. They don't believe in any kind of frills or any kind of fun or anything like that. So they're very, religious and they come across real spiritual. They're proud of that. Or they don't drink much, or they don't do this much, or they don't do that. So they're proud of that. They're good at that. They're holy. They're holier than thou. And so, unfortunately, this is a tendency. Some people look to religion and it becomes a source of pride. And so it seems to me that in the case of Judaism, that was true in many ways. The Pharisees, I think, were the most like serious Christians today. They were people who wanted to be, the name means separate. They were separate. They wanted to keep themselves separate, be holy. They realized that Israel was punished by God for getting into the world too much, being idolaters and sinning and so forth. And they realized God had punished them in exile for that. So they were like, we're not going to repeat those errors. We're going to live right. We're going to do what God wants. And that's a noble intention. Unfortunately, our human tendency is to always kind of swing too far one way or the other, isn't it? And so they're going to be pious and they're going to be righteous. Well, then what happens is they become proud of being so pious and righteous. It's actually said that some Pharisees, so they wouldn't look at a woman to lust after her. They would like cover their eyes and run into things. And they'd be proud that they were bruised because see how holy they were. They don't look at women, things like that. So there's this pride. And there's this feeling that, they do everything right. Those people over there, they're sinners, but not us. We're the holy ones. So Jesus comes in, and of course, Jesus loves religious people as much as irreligious people. He loves the bikers and the prostitutes, yeah, but he also loves, rabbis and priests. He loves religious people. But he doesn't play their game. He doesn't see them as, oh, you're so pious. Wow, look at you. You pray out loud in front of the people. Look at you. You're so holy. He doesn't do that. He says, you know what? You're kind of proud of your holiness, aren't you? You're kind of greedy. You want money. You want people to give you money because you're a rabbi or whatever. You think you should be in the highest, the best place at a feast or a festival. You want everybody to look to you and say, look, the rabbi's here. Oh, the rabbi. You like that, don't you? And see, if he addresses that, people, I'm a religious leader. I know what it's like. We like to be, we're important. We're spiritual. No, we're not. We're just folks, right? But it's our human tendency to elevate ourselves. So Jesus didn't do that. In fact, he scathingly denounced them at times. He said, you hypocrites, you snakes and vipers, who warned you to flee the wrath to come? How can you possibly escape the fires of hell? Guess what? That didn't go over real well. So the Jewish leaders in the early days turned against him, except for a few. There were some exceptions. Nicodemus was an exception. He came to Christ. He wanted to hear from him. And later on, at the Sanhedrin, at the trial of Christ, he said, look, shouldn't we just hear what the man is saying? He was open. Joseph of Arimathea was open. And the book of Acts says in the early days of Christianity, many priests came to Christ. So there are exceptions. People did, there were some who weren't all filled with pride and who did see the glory and the truth and honesty and the righteousness of Jesus. But many did not. And of course, he threatened their established order of things. See, he threatened them. They weren't important if he was important. This itinerant guy, he doesn't have any degrees from our schools. He's not pious. He's not one of us. He's not at the temple. And he's drawing bigger crowds than we are. So they were jealous of him. They were envious of him. He was like displacing them. And then, like another thing that added in, and the Sadducees saw this part, they said, look, he's drawing such big crowds. The Romans are going to get upset. And they're going to kick us out. This guy's going to cause trouble. And so there are many reasons that they persecuted Jesus. And then his followers, they thought, when they killed Jesus, thank God we finally got rid of that guy. But then what happens? He has thousands of followers in no time. They're just mushrooming, sprouting up everywhere. And the Jews were threatened by this. And they said, look, we told you to quit talking about this stuff. You stop it or you're going to be beaten. You're going to be in prison. And they started jailing him. And then eventually, the first one they killed was Stephen. And Stephen, of course, was a Hellenistic Jew. And he told them they were stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. I mean, that was like the biggest blow. He basically slapped them in the face. He told them they were hypocrites, so they killed him. They killed him for it. So in the early days, everywhere the gospel went, Jews were the persecutors of the Christian church. And that went on for some time. The Romans in the beginning were actually defenders of Christian leaders. Because you see this in the book of Acts. They defended Paul at times. They'd say, look, this guy hasn't done anything wrong. They came upon him when the Jews were beating him and trying to kill him, and they actually protected him. They escorted him to Caesarea. Various times, Roman leaders did not persecute Paul. They did not do anything against the church. In the beginning, they thought it's like, this is some religious argument or something. Who cares? We don't care about this. It's not important. And it's between the Jews and the Jews anyway. They're all Jews. Who cares? It's just a Jewish intramural argument, However, as time went by, that began to change. And the Romans became involved. The first real bad persecution came through Emperor Nero in the 60s AD. And Nero was an incredibly evil man. He was very perverse and actually most likely had mental problems. And at one point, he actually set fire to a section of the city of Rome. And people heard that he did it and they were blaming him. And he was not doing so well in his leadership role. And he was in a kind of an unstable position. So he couldn't afford to have the populace rise up against him. So he said, who did it? The Christians. They started the fire. And so Christians were kind of a different group. And so, it's easy to be against the folks that are not one part of us. So, okay, they did it. And so people persecuted them, and Nero persecuted them. He was responsible for the death of Peter and Paul. He beheaded both of them. And he also actually, at one point, had Christians wrapped in tar or had tar poured on them. And he had them burned to death in order to light the way for his chariots. So that was the first horrible persecution that came against Christians. Now, it was more localized in Rome. And the notable martyrs at that period were Peter and Paul. I have a document here, which I just clicked to, that tells about the periods of persecution, the Roman persecution. If you'd like that, just let me know and I'll email it to you. Let me just kind of go through some of the major points very quickly. Nero was the first. After him came Domitian. He reigned from 90 to 96 AD. He was very capricious, but the persecution was sporadic. It was centered in Rome and Asia Minor. He wanted everybody to offer incense to the genius of the emperor. They kind of recognized the emperor as God, the emperors as gods. And so he was saying, I want all my citizens to burn a pinch of incense. You have to go, to the temple and burn incense to the genius of the emperor. Well, Christians couldn't do that. So he was furious. Why won't you do this? Look, I'm telling you what to do. Just do it. People that don't have a strong faith and a belief in an absolute truth don't understand Christians. Why won't you just go along? I mean, burn some incense. They don't understand us. We know there's absolute truth. There's an absolute God. We don't just do what you want. We can't do that. There's things we can't do because we're Christian. So he killed some famous Christians, Clement of Rome, and he had John the Apostle exiled to the island of Patmos, where, of course, he got the Revelation, wrote the book of Revelation. But he was mostly persecuting people in Rome and in Asia Minor, the 7 churches of Asia that John wrote to and all that. The next guy to persecute was Trajan, 98 to 117. His was also sporadic. And he lumped Christians together with people who were like revolutionaries or fighting against the Roman Empire, the government of Rome. And so their patriotism was suspect. And Christians were executed when they were found, but they were not to be sought out. Trajan said, I don't want you hunting them down, but if you find any, just, kill them immediately. The next guy was Hadrian. He also just continued the policies of Trajan. And people who brought false witness against Christians, though, he had them punished. Before that, you could bring a false witness and get people punished, and you'd get off if you were lying. Then there was Marcus Aurelius, who was actually a Stoic philosopher emperor, and he opposed Christianity on philosophical grounds. He killed Justin Martyr, some other famous folks. Then there was Septimus Severus. I don't like the name Severus. I'd hate to have an emperor named Severus. Severe, it doesn't sound too good. He killed quite a few. He killed Perpetua. By the way, if you can get a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, it tells about a lot of these and the famous ones. Perpetua is quite a story. Irenaeus, his story, how he was killed. Very, very horrible stories of persecution, but incredible courage of these Christians. Severus said that conversion to Christianity was to be forbidden. Then there was Maximus the Thracian in the year 235, 236. He ordered Christian clergy executed. I wouldn't want to be a pastor back then. And Christians were opposed because they supported the emperor's predecessor that he had assassinated. So he didn't like them because they liked his predecessor. Then there was Decius. This was the first empire-wide persecution. He was horrible. He killed many, many people. You had to offer incense to the emperor, and he wanted the Roman Empire to return to paganism. There have been so many people converting to Christianity. He was sick of it. He thought this was a terrible thing. We need to go back to the way we used to be. We need to go back to our gods. We need to get rid of these Christians. We need to exterminate them. Of course, he failed, but he tried to do that. That was 249 to 251. Then there was Valerian in 257, 260. Christians' property was confiscated. Christians were prohibited the right of assembly. The worst guy of all, the last guy I'll mention here, was Diocletian. Diocletian reigned from 303 to 311. And this guy really, really, at first he didn't want to stamp out Christianity, but he had a co-emperor. He's the guy who divided the Roman Empire into East and West. And he said, instead of having one emperor, we'll have two, which we will call Augusti, the two, your Augustus in the East and your Augustus in the West. And then under each Augustus will be a Caesar. And the Caesar will be kind of like his successor when he dies or whatever, and will help him to rule the empire. Diocletian had to do this, I learned, because Rome got in terrible trouble in the 3rd century. For 50 years, they were declining. And you got to realize, when you crush everybody and invade everybody and just plunder everybody, you have a lot of enemies. You got a lot of hostility out there. And on all their borders were enemies seeking to topple them, to steal from them, to drive them back. And there were people who were oppressed by Rome who wanted to get free. So you're always having rebellions popping up. And when you're supporting soldiers everywhere, you go broke. So they were really in economic straits, and they were having so many wars and everything. And think about it, you have a war in Persia, way over in what's today, Syria or Iraq, Iran. And, messengers are sent to tell the emperor, hey, we're having a war over here. They're rebelling. We're in trouble. Well, how long does it take for the message to get back to Rome? Months. Meanwhile, these armies are fighting and they're conquering and everything. You're not hearing about it. And then you say, okay, we'll send troops, and you send some legions over there. Well, then, meanwhile, in the West, over in Britain or over in Gaul or what's Germany today, you got wars going on, and they send a messenger, and it takes weeks or months to get to Rome. See, they couldn't support this thing. So Diocletian said, we got to do something to save the empire. We'll divide it up and have 4 leaders. And so he was doing all that. But in the midst of that, he also was one of those who said, man, we got so many problems. What's causing all the problems? Probably the gods are not pleased with us because we got all these people converting to Christianity. They're turning from the Roman gods. This is not good. I want all Christians eliminated. I want churches destroyed. I want the scriptures burned. Christians have no civil rights. You have to sacrifice to our gods. And so that's how serious he was. At first, he wasn't going to do that, but his co-emperor Galerius talked him into it, and they did it. And so I can only imagine how horrible it was, to be a Christian in those days. Now, you got to realize every Christian wasn't killed, of course, obviously. It wasn't that widespread. They didn't have that many authorities that could move in and arrest all Christians. So, but it was empire-wide, and if you were sort of prominent, you were in danger. In many areas, it was just more serious than in others. Let me turn this off. And so this is really just a horrible thing to think about, the persecution of Christians. But you know what? Even terrible things like this don't last forever. And what happened was in 311 AD, Diocletian actually stepped down from being the emperor. He's the only emperor in Roman history that ever abdicated and just gave up, and so did his co-emperor. And so Galerius had to take over, and Galerius saw it wasn't working. He hated the Christians too, but he saw this just isn't working. We're getting more and more Christians, even though we're persecuting them. And, Tertullian, the famous church father in North Africa, said that. He said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You kill us and we come back tenfold. So finally, the Roman emperor said, this just isn't working. And he said, let's put a stop to it. Because also another thing about this is by this time, Christians were gaining favor with people. There were Christians everywhere. Everybody had somebody they knew who was a Christian. And these Christian folks, they're not that bad. They're our neighbors. They're the butcher. They're the baker. They're the carpenter or whatever. They live among us. They work with us. They have their kids among us. They're nice people. When we're sick, they came and brought us food. They took care of us. We don't want them to be persecuted. So the people began to have favor. So in 311 AD, that terrible time of persecution finally came to an end. First, it was just a decree of cease and desist, no more persecution. Then, we'll talk about this a little later, but just a very short time after that, there was an edict of toleration that was actually passed where it's no, Christians are allowed to be Christian, to worship, to do whatever they want. Leave them completely alone. And it wasn't very long after that, I think it was 380 AD, where actually Christianity was declared the state religion of the Roman Empire. Can you believe it? So it was a time of horror, a time of great suffering, a time of great sacrifice. But it ended. The people of God made it through somehow. Many were brave and were martyred. And even their martyrdom actually won other people to Christ, because the people would say, look at these people are willing to die for this. There must be something true about it. And many came to Christ because of that. And so I'll wrap up this session with that. And next time we're going to talk about some of the heresies that came into the church and some of the ways in which the church dealt with heresies, which are false teachings. So I hope you'll tune in for that one.